Hello and welcome to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Friends. We apologize for the technical difficulties that have started this program off late. I am your host, Leon Wolf, and today is Thursday, March the 5th, on a cold winter day in the middle of spring. We're glad that you decided to join us, and we again apologize for the delay. Allow me to introduce our panel of co-hosts. First of all, joining us as always, we have our regular co-host, Scott Lincicome of the Cato Institute. Scott, thank you for joining us. And F. Bill McMorris of the Washington Free Beacon is with us as always. Say hello to the people, Bill. And joining us in front of the camera for the second time is our normal producer, Aaron Gardner. And Aaron is going to be a panelist tonight. Aaron has many valuable things to say. We're delighted to have him on the show, even though every time he doesn't produce, things like tonight tend to happen. And we're also delighted to have Brian Fonan, a very dear and old friend of mine of the Libre Initiative, is going to join us, former Red State contributor. And we're delighted to have him here as well. Let's jump right into the news of the day. And we're going to talk at first about the kind of news du jour, the scandal du jour having to do with Hillary Clinton. And, of course, for those who haven't been following this, it was revealed a couple of days ago that Hillary Clinton set up her own private email server while she was at the State Department, which she used to send a number of potentially sensitive emails pertaining to her job. This, of course, is contrary to federal regulations and federal law pertaining to the maintenance of all records, and seems to have been designed deliberately to have shielded Hillary from having to turn over any emails that she did not want to turn over. Brian, we're going to send the first question over to you as our guest host. It's customary for us to go to our guest first. There was a good column in National Review, I think it was yesterday, Charles C.W. Click, and when he looked at this particular scandal, he says, you know, this scandal is going to be damaging to Hillary in particular, and the reason for that is that it confirms people's preconceived notions about Hillary. That is to say that she's a secretive, vain, entitled, and perpetually scheming person. But could it also be said to be true on the other side of that coin that it won't damage her at all because it plays into what people already know about her, what's kind of already baked into the public perception of her? Which do you think is more true?
I hate to say it, but I think that the latter is probably more true. I was looking earlier today at the Hillary's favorability ratings, and we all know that that she's a very well-known public figure. She's been out there for years. According to the latest polling, her favorables are about 47%, her unfavorables are about 46%. So we see that everyone has decided about Hillary. Everyone knows how they feel about her. This scandal certainly is going to sort of reinforce the ideas that people have about her. I think it's obviously a problem that that she is sort of putting out there, how this is a great demonstration of the fact that she doesn't feel the laws apply to her. But probably most people have made up their minds one way or the other. You know, either you like or you don't, and a lot of that I think is probably baked into the cake.
So Aaron, let's go to you next. And there was a great article at the Daily Beast yesterday by former Bush administration official Ron Christie, and what he wrote about was, he says, look, what you have to understand is when you come into a government job, your first day on the job, I mean, literally there's like tape over your keyboards that has on there this warning that all records are property of the government, that you can't delete anything, you can't destroy anything. You log onto the computer, there's these constant warnings about the fact that you have to maintain all your records. Federal law requires that all these records be maintained. Hillary's defenses to this, besides her first defense of, you know, Hillary's kind of an idiot about computers, but her team's defenses to this indicate kind of a return to the hair-splitting days of it depends upon what the meaning of the word is, right? I mean, they say that essentially, look, there's two people involved in every email. There's the sender and the receiver, and all the emails that were sent to the State Department or to any other government offices were kept on those servers, and so we're in technical compliance with the law. And what Ron Christie said about that is that this episode is going to serve us to a reminder that if we re-elect the Clintons, these are the days we're going back to. It depends upon what the meaning of the word is days. You think America's ready to go back to those days?
You know, I don't know if they're ready to go back to those days. I don't even really think the left is ready to go back to those days. There's some people who have said that, you know, some of this is to inoculate Clinton. There's some people who have said that this is to make sure Clinton isn't going to be the nominee for the left this time around. But, you know, I kind of disagree on the point of, you know, this all being baked into the cake. the cake's never baked. We're constantly baking a new cake every election cycle. We're constantly bringing new people in, and if we constantly allow things to go under the cover, it's already baked into the cake. We're basically allowing the left to redefine themselves to a new generation for whom history began in 2010 or 2012 or 2014 or 2016. So I think it's important that we always continue these drumbeats against the Clintons and everyone else. I mean, this whole administration that we've had, from Clinton to Holder to Kerry to Obama, has just been filled and riddled with scandalous people. And the American people, frankly, I think they're sick of that sort of government.
All right, Bill. Well, let me go to you next. And Ala Pundit at Hot Air wrote about this as well. And his take on this is a little different from Aaron's. It's kind of closer to mine. And I'm going to read it at some length from what Ala had to say about this. And I want you to kind of give your reaction to it. Ala says about this that what's obvious about Hillary is not that she just tried to hide them, mind you, but she planned to do so from the start. Remember, the ClintonEmail.com domain was registered before she was even confirmed as Secretary of State. She never even activated an official State Department address. She was not confused about the rules, as she's claiming now. Unaccountability was the idea from before the beginning. The going theory is that she did it for the same reason the Clintons engage in any corrupt activity, which is that they think they're above the law and know that it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. But underlying that is a more basic reality. She did it because she knew people outside the political class wouldn't care. True or untrue?
Absolutely. Absolutely true. This is the type of scandal that really doesn't get the average voter going. We're going to react to it, and hopefully it will inspire journalists and the watchdogs to take a more aggressive attitude toward penetrating this bubble and exposing it to readers. But the average person just doesn't get that worked up about this type of scandal. Ala Pundit's also fantastic take was on Twitter when he said Clinton cared more about American voters not reading her emails than she did about Chinese hackers reading her emails. I mean, this network wasn't secure. And I mean, when you start bringing that up, the security implications here, that's how you make people care. Average voter doesn't really care too much about FOIA, even though I think it's extremely important. But if we can highlight the security issues and the potential for all sorts of, I guess, security breaches that they opened and exposed the country to, I think that's going to make a big difference and resonate heavily with voters. I will say this about Hillary's excuse. You know what? I think she can get away with this whole I don't really understand computers thing, and I don't remember, never setting up a State Department account. But that's because she's so old and probably has Alzheimer's already. So I think this puts the age issue back on the table, as well as the grievous head injury that's obviously left her with traumatic brain injury and leaves her unfit for office.
She may not be ready for the 3 a.m. call, but she's definitely ready for the 4 p.m. Dinner special. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Exactly.
So putting aside the question of whether Hillary understands this through the kind of electronic interference cast by her Walker bill, isn't it? When people look at this, it's not that she didn't understand, and isn't it in fact the case that she had a very sophisticated understanding of technology? I mean, isn't that what this scandal shows? I mean, they literally set up their own, essentially, server farm and controlled all of their access. This is not something a dummy does on. She didn't have a Gmail. She had a sophisticated system.
Yeah, well, it's sophisticated, albeit with lax security, and I think that's where we should hit her.
Sure.
But I mean, this is a woman who tried to use her experience in governance to beat Barack Obama in 2008. She's the heir apparent in 2016 because she's so experienced. Yes, she's experienced. She knows what FOIA is. She was in the White House during several investigations that she and her husband managed to survive. She was in the Senate. The Senate, not subject to FOIA, never mind. But whatever. She knows what FOIA is. She knew what she was doing. And the fact that so many in the media rushed to say, I wonder what Hillary staffer screwed this up, just is so telling about how the media is going to treat her throughout the campaign, from here until Election Day itself. What's nice about the fact that she's now running afoul of the media is the fact that the media loves FOIA. And if you try to mess with us and our FOIA requests, we may actually not take kindly to it. So maybe this will make some establishment reporters and some mainstream reporters take a more aggressive approach to Hillary. It's a long shot. It's a Ben Carson type long shot.
Right. So let me segue on that over to Scott and say that there's an article in the New York Times a couple days ago when this scandal first broke that indicated that there were some rumblings, I guess, that Democrats are allegedly surprised by this. They're surprised and they're shocked by secrecy from the Clintons and wondering, my gosh, yeah, is Hillary really going to be the best candidate? How could anyone possibly be surprised by this from a Clinton? I mean, do you think that that's legitimate, that people are legitimately surprised, or do you think maybe it's a sign that the Dems aren't that ready for Hillary after all?
Well, I mean, I think that yes, you can be legitimately surprised if you are kind of a detached Hollywood liberal who is just, kind of a knee-jerk Democrat who is just all about breaking the glass ceiling and being on Team Hillary. So to finally pay attention for a second and realize, oh my gosh, these people are so slimy. I had no idea. Particularly if you're in your like 20s and you were 12 years old when Bill Clinton was doing his thing in the Oval Office. It's quite possible. And then others are just simply blind to it. I mean, a lot of people have confirmation biases. We all do. And so you can also just shut your ears off if you want to. But I do, I mean, as much as I tend to agree that the voters are not going to, that this is not going to be the voters' big issue in 20 months, at the same time, I do think this is going to give donors and kind of high-level Dems more pause. Hillary's pre-campaign has been pretty much an epic train wreck. It has been a substanceless void. It has been.
It has depended on its success for Hillary not being in the news, right?
Right. Her big play is to hide, and it's actually worked. That's the best thing she's done. Remember when she went on that horrific book tour, and her approval ratings kept going down. She sold no books. So, this has not been smooth sailing. And so, to the extent there is a high-profile scandal, even a high-profile Acela Corridor scandal, it's going to give more people pause. And it's going to give people like Elizabeth Warren and those in the Team Obama camp who are very much more ideologically inclined to support Warren and don't really like Hillary and Hillary's folks, more ammunition to get maybe in the game and have some bucks behind her.
So the next question is going to go to Joe Cunningham, who's filling in as our producer tonight. I'm going to have him answer a couple questions. We're a panelist short. So Joe, there was an article in The Hill yesterday that Trey Gowdy's and his staffers are already saying, well, now you know what's going to have to happen is we're going to have Hillary back in front of our committee a few more times, and this situation could probably drag on into 2016. And I guess the question I have is what's the point of diminishing returns with these Benghazi hearings? I mean, does there come a point where people say, look, we've heard enough about this, we don't want to hear enough about this, we feel like you're turning it into a sideshow? Do you think it will help or hurt the eventual Republican nominee if Trey Gowdy's committee is still subpoenaing Hillary Clinton to appear in front of them every few months come 2016?
I don't know what kind of diminishing returns would be coming up on all the Benghazi talk because of the fact that, well, let's take Aaron State for a second. The war on women talk really tanked an outgoing Democratic senator. But as far as Benghazi goes, yeah, that faded out for a while, but all of a sudden that suddenly coming back up, and there's a resurgence in what could potentially be there. Now, this is, 3 years ago, or coming up on 3 years, the whole Benghazi thing. But what Hillary Clinton hid, what she didn't share, what she knew, what she didn't know, is probably going to play into how competent is she going to be getting that 3 a.m. phone call. And it's not going to be so much the Benghazi scandal, but, okay, what else could she screw up? And that's the biggest issue here, is not what can she do for the country, but what is she going to screw up if she made a colossal screw up that was what happened in Benghazi. So I'm not sure if – I think that saying Benghazi, Benghazi, Benghazi over and over again might have diminishing returns, but I think that the implications from what she did there would not.
So let me go to Aaron real quick, because I know he and I have a little bit of a disagreement about this. And when I look at this, and I tend to agree with kind of what Joe says and also what Bill says, which is to say, look, this particular scandal with the disappearing emails, I think tying it into Benghazi is a mistake. And the reason for that is that turns Benghazi into a story about a scandal instead of a story about incompetence. And my belief, based upon 16 years of watching these people, is that you cannot kill a Clinton with scandals. I mean, it cannot be done. And I think that the way, if Benghazi is going to have some traction, it has to be about the fact that she's incompetent. And I understand the frustration with the fact that she's probably covering up information and so on and so forth, but I think that the more that this becomes about a cover-up and a scandal-based story, the less effectiveness it might have. Aaron, what's your response to that?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think you have to sacrifice the incompetency angle to get there with tagging this back to Benghazi. I mean, when you come right down to it, you can tag incompetency all across the board. Almost 9 months ago, I wrote about a group called Veterans for a Strong America doing a FOIA request for all the communications, phone records, and everything, personal and government records, for Hillary Clinton, because she had been out talking about how she had worked from home and she preferred to work from home. She got onto the Daily Show with Jon Stewart and bragged about how she liked to work from her home office and that she did like 90% of her work from there. So it seemed obvious that there was probably something that was there. The fact that no one picked it up for 8 months and everybody just now is figuring it out, it shows that there is more here. There's more to be looked at that people should be looking at. The fact, you saw things come out today, full disclosure, Veterans for a Strong America is now a client of mine, but you saw the whole seize the servers hashtag come out today, and you saw two different stories come out today about Veterans for a Strong America suing the State Department. I think people and activists actually do like these things, and they do. It is motivating to see people fighting back, especially when we have leadership who doesn't fight anything. I mean, we're going to repeal Obamacare, right? We're going to hold people accountable for Benghazi, right? No, we're not, unless we have people like who are actually going to take it to the limit and fight people like Clinton and say, yeah, we understand that a lot of people just are okay with them being scandalous, but there's still a whole lot of Americans, a lot of disenfranchised voters who are out there saying, I want to be hopeful in America again. I want what Reagan brought in and actually having an optimistic outlook on America and what I can give to my kids. That's what I want. I think that's what most people want. That's why I think things like this do work.
So let me throw this over to Brian and ask you this question. What do you think the probability is that the discovery of this private email and any kind of efforts that might be undertaken will actually unearth any new information? I mean, as a lawyer, when we go and we talk to clients, we always say deleting emails from your inbox is a worthless enterprise, because there's always 4 copies at least of any email that exists. There's the one in your inbox, there's the one in your email server, there's the one in the recipient's email server, and the one in the recipient's email inbox. At least 4 that are going to exist of any email. So you deleting it out of your inbox doesn't do anything other than make you look bad. So in light of the fact that any emails that she might have sent to anyone in a government office, or at least kept on their email server, and presumably have already been looked at or had the opportunity to look at. What do you think the likelihood is that we're going to get any new information out of the revelation that this domain existed, even if we get a full accounting from Hillary of what actually was in that inbox?
I mean, I don't particularly expect that we're going to see new material out of this. I think that's probably somewhat unlikely. Clearly, House committees, congressional committees have been over. Benghazi correspondence. You'd have to be a dummy if you're a recipient of email from a Clinton email address, and you work for State Department. You'd have to be a dummy to sort of try and conceal that mail. I feel like we would have had indications already if there was a lot of State Department recipients who had received this stuff and then produced it for congressional review. Obviously, the Clintons have complete control over the server that was being used for this email. We won't see new stuff from that unless they want us to see it. And I don't particularly think that's all that likely. Would have produced it already. I think one thing to watch for, they talk about how, or it's been talked about how, the American voters tend to choose a president who corrects sort of some of the defects of the previous president. I think that the one thing that's important here is that people have perceived Barack Obama perhaps to be someone who goes unilaterally, who does what he wants to do, who doesn't worry about Congress, who at times doesn't worry about the rules. And this is, if you're a voter looking at the 2016 choice, you don't need a reminder that Hillary Clinton and the Clintons in general have always felt that the rules maybe don't apply to them the same way they do to other people. I just don't think it helps. I don't know that we'll see anything new, but it's a bad optic to have going into the presidential race.
So let me follow up on that. One of the things that we've kind of discussed at length here is the fact that Benghazi, there's been well over a dozen, I think there's been 14 or 15 congressional hearings about this. I'm going to turn this next question over to Bill. It's been like 14, 15 congressional hearings. They've already looked at something like 25,000 documents plus that have been turned over. In the course of that search, what I don't understand is why we're just now finding out about the existence of this particular email address, right? So presumably, if we've already subpoenaed records of numerous State Department and Department of Defense officials, why did none of those emails that we've looked over have in the header from Hillary@ClintonEmail.com? And why didn't somebody say, hey, wait a minute, what is Hillary@ClintonEmail.com? Can you think of a reason why there might be kind of that hole in the records that we already have?
Glad you asked me this question. No, I can't think of a reason. You can move on to the next person now.
I mean, I'll throw it open to the panel. This is what occurs to me.
Hypothetical, everybody.
if this is the email that she used as the primary means of conducting business with the State Department, why have none of the other people who've worked at State, who have had their email inboxes gone through, had an email from Hillary@ClintonEmail.com that this has come up before now? Maybe there isn't a good answer.
It defies reality. I mean, you really have to suspend your disbelief an extreme amount to get through to this. And I mean, you saw the whole blow-up between Gawker and Hillary World about this, where, J.K. Trotter over at Gawker, put in a FOIA request, 2-3 years ago for all of these various records of top Hillary aides, and noticed that the reply to the request was that one of them didn't have any emails.
Yeah.
A press secretary had never sent an email to a reporter before, according to the State Department. And I mean, this is one of the things. The State Department, you are better able to hide this than other departments because foreign affairs agencies generally get a little bit more leeway in the courts, a little bit more privilege when it comes to withholding information or stonewalling information. I have FOIAs open with the DoD now that are way past statutory deadline. But of course, it's the Defense Department. They're not going to have to actually fulfill these requests for years. So I think Hillary benefited from that in the sense that these guys filed FOIAs, and I'm sure when the scandal broke, reporters started going through their sent mail files and going, when did I send that email to the State Department again? I mean, so I think this is going to have legs through those sorts of stories, and I don't think we're going to get an adequate answer from Clinton World, ever, on this.
Well, to me, that is the one thing that makes me believe that there are a significant number of documents out there that we don't yet have, because as somebody who as an attorney has gone through these document reviews before, and I'm sure that Scott may have had this experience as well, whenever you get a document production, you get these custodians, and they have these email headers, and you kind of become familiar with the names that you see in your document reviews, emails to and from the same sets of people. Inevitably, a domain turns up that you're not familiar with, some email address, and you go back and you say, well, you go back to the other side's attorneys, you say, well, what is this email address? Why is it on? And they say, oh, well, that's so-and-so custodian's home email address. Then you have to, oh, well, we want those emails too as well. And you end up with this discussion. The fact that this hasn't come up before now, in spite of the fact that all these tens of thousands of emails have been turned over, indicates to me that at least there may be a significant hole in the emails that have already been turned over to the State Department in response to congressional subpoenas. But we'll see how it plays out in the weeks and months to come. Let's move on a little bit to our second topic of the day, which is the King v. Burwell Supreme Court case that is being argued. Actually, was argued yesterday before the Supreme Court. And I'm going to go first of all to Scott with the first question on this. And among the people who are making, I guess, what you would call an honest defense of the subsidies for the folks who are on the federal exchanges, probably Jonathan Cohn is among the better of those folks. And what his argument is essentially he's got to say, look, this is essentially like a cookbook, right? So let's say you had this cookbook, The Joy of Cooking, and it says you can make a pancake and you need to use butter and sugar and a number of other ingredients. And if you read just that page, you might think if you don't have butter and sugar, you're out of luck. But if you look at other places in the cookbook, it says, well, you can substitute molasses for sugar or oil for butter or whatever and so on and so forth. And so if you look in Section 1321 of the ACA, it says if there is an estate exchange, the federal government can set up one that's essentially the same. Is that argument enough to save the law? Set aside the politics of this and what we know ideologically about the judges. You as a judge, Scott Lincicome, would that be enough in your view to save the law or these subsidies?
Well, definitely not. Now, full disclosure, I deal with statutory construction and international law construction, treaty interpretation all the time. So I have, for over a decade now, had it beaten into my head that the text is what matters. So, you only get to that wonderful cookbook analogy and the rest of this intent and all this stuff if the text is ambiguous. And the fact is that the text is not ambiguous. That it's been nice to read before the oral arguments. There have been a lot of intellectually honest law professors who have been out there and said, look, if this were not about Obamacare, if this were a normal statutory construction case, this would be done. It would be over. It is so obviously it says what it says, and it says it multiple times, and there's no alternate definitions. There is no ambiguity. And in statutory construction, not to sound like a broken record, but you only get to the rest of this stuff if there is ambiguity out there, and you get to this whole idea of Chevron deference and this idea that we're supposed to defer to the interpretation of the bureaucrats. You only get to that if there is ambiguity from the statute. There is no ambiguity here. So yeah, of course I'm biased as heck and would love to see the plaintiffs win here. At the same time, the law says what it says, and I invite the people out there, if you want to have some fun, you should just read a little bit of what Justice Scalia said during the oral arguments about all this, because it's pretty funny, actually, how it's just so cut and dry as to what the text says that you really have to do a lot of mental gymnastics, whether it's this new federalism idea that Kennedy brought up that everybody's all hot and bothered about. You really have to do a lot of things, and a lot of things that are, this is why people hate us lawyers. You don't just read the words. No, you have to all this other penumbras and all this crap. The words say what they say, and it should be pretty much a slam dunk. But we know better, so we'll see.
So I'm going to stay with you, Scott. Let's talk a little bit about Justice Kennedy's questions about the federalism concerns that he raised. Michael Cannon had an article in National Review, 7 Things You Should Know About the IRS Rule That Was Challenged in King versus Burwell. I believe that's the title of the article. I encourage everybody to go and look at it. It is a damning article of the rulemaking process by which these particular subsidies came into being. And he talks about, among other things, that the IRS rule initially tracked the statutory language and was later changed. talked about the fact that when Congress investigated the rulemaking process, they found internal emails from IRS personnel clearly showing knowledge that they lacked the statutory authority to issue these subsidies to the people who were on the federal exchanges. And they failed to consider, additionally, the regular federal practice of conditioning state behavior on the acceptance of federal funds. Or maybe I said that backwards. Conditioning the acceptance of federal funds on state behavior. And Kennedy, in his questions today, acted like this was some novel or unique concept. But, I mean, like you, I've read these things now for years and years and years. This is something that happens. The federal government does this every day. Almost every appropriations bill they pass essentially forces or conditions the states receiving money on their willingness to participate in some federal program. Just talk for a little bit about how common that is and how unusual it is for the IRS to overlook that very normal fact of modern federalism.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend, if people watching are really interested in this issue, Jonathan Adler today at the Volokh Conspiracy, which is now in the Washington Post. One of the few things the Post has done quite right is incorporating them. Had a great post on Kennedy's arguments and on the history. And basically, Adler went through and noted that there actually has already been a Supreme Court case, and not something from the 1800s. This is from maybe 15, 20 years ago max, on this exact issue. And it's, can the federal government condition state behavior on regulatory implications? In other words, can you have very bad regulatory implications under a law, under regulation, if a state doesn't act a certain way? And the court said, yes, of course you can. And so not only would to accept the kind of where Kennedy was maybe probing a bit, not only to accept that, that wouldn't only just overturn existing Supreme Court precedent. And as most of us know, justices are very reluctant to do that. But beyond that, there are tons of laws out there, as you mentioned, Leon, that do this. The ones that Adler brought up, there are two that he brought up. One related to waste disposal, and the other being the Clean Air Act. And he said the only thing that makes the ACA unique from all of these other laws that do this is that you finally had a critical mass of states say, no, we're not going to do it. Whereas in the case of the Clean Air Act, the states didn't do this. A couple decided not to go along. He said, so the reason this has become an issue is that you have a critical mass of states, 30 plus states that have just told the federal government to go pound sand, and they're willing to accept the regulatory outcomes. And that is novel, but that's not novel from a legal perspective. There's nothing legally novel about this. It's purely a facts issue. So, liberal judges and liberal lawyers like the facts to dictate, but again, if we're going to be lawyers and if we're going to actually interpret the law, there's not much of a legal argument there. You just really have to throw yourself on the, lots of people are going to get hurt by this and the rest of that non-legal nonsense.
So Brian, let me go over to you about this. And what's interesting to me is I watch the way that the left is reacting to the very fact that King v. Burwell is in front of the Supreme Court, is that it seems clear that they have gotten the message somewhere along the line, and there were rumblings to this effect, that Chief Justice Roberts was essentially publicly pressured into not striking down Obamacare as a whole because he didn't want it to affect his legacy on the court. And so what it seems like a lot of their commentary about this is not designed to engage the legal arguments whatsoever, but to instead say as loudly as they can and forcefully as they can that doing so would be an act of unconscionable activism and would forever stain the legacy of the Roberts Court. And as I watch all of this unfold, I'm forced to think back to Justice Kennedy's decision in Casey versus Planned Parenthood in 1992, and many people thought that the Supreme Court was going to overturn Roe versus Wade, and they ended up surprisingly not doing so. One of the key lines, one of the key justifications that Justice Kennedy did for not doing that is he said essentially in his opinion, look, if we overturn Roe versus Wade, we as a Supreme Court, we're going to give off the perception that we as a court were swayed by all these idiot protesters who come out here year after year on January the 22nd and march to the Supreme Court steps And we can't have that happen, because then every time we do something unpopular, they'll come march million by million and come down here. And I guess what we're seeing here, to some extent, at least to the extent that liberals believe that happened with John Roberts, is validation of what Justice Kennedy said about the way that people respond to these decisions. And so I guess the question is, are the leftists, are they going to stop anytime soon with this line of attack? And secondly, do you believe that there's any merit to what they say, that that's why John Roberts changed his decision in the original Obamacare case?
I don't know. You've certainly heard that Roberts' opinion changed. There's talk about that Roberts' opinion changed at some point. And I'm not a lawyer. I haven't read the opinions in the depth that some of you guys have. But clearly there were expectations. It seems that Roberts was ready to overturn the law, and then eventually changed opinion and decided not to. Is the court politicized? Are they open to public pressure? I have a hard time saying that they're not. I mean, you encounter a situation where the court gets involved in more and more issues in our day-to-day life. You have a referee. The referee isn't supposed to be subject to public pressure. The referee is supposed to just call, the umpire is supposed to call balls and strikes as he sees them. The Supreme Court doesn't seem to be doing that anymore. And if you see that you can affect the outcome at the Supreme Court by pressure, why not do that? And I think we're starting to see that on both sides. We're seeing more conservatives who recognize that hey, it doesn't hurt to sort of send signals to the Supreme Court that it wouldn't be bad to rule in our favor. That don't decide necessarily exactly 100% on the merits, but decide a little bit on public opinion. That's unfortunate, but I think it goes with the politicization of the court and the involvement of the court in more and more the things that we do every day.
Yeah, but the court's partially, if not most, to blame for this. Again, I believe it was Scalia who said the best way to stop the politicization of law is for judges to stop reacting to this type of hyperbole and pressuring tactics. This whole this greenhouse effect, they call it, for Linda Greenhouse in the New York Times. The idea was that justices are now starting to tailor their votes so that they can get favorable treatment by the press and by the political class. The best way to solve that is to simply be immune to it, to not fall victim to that pressure. And the more that the court does bend to the non-legal and kind of political pressures out there, the more politicized it becomes, and the more that you incentivize bad actors. And I'm not going to throw punches here because it makes me extremely ticked off as a somewhat ethical lawyer. That there is this we don't talk about law anymore. The drivel you see coming out of particularly these days left-wing websites about this case and about the other Sebelius is maddening. It has nothing to do with the legal merits. These aren't people who have any understanding of any aspects of the law. It is all about the touchy-feels and about the I wants. And it's nonsense.
They've admitted that, Scott. I mean, there was a Sean Davis from the Federalist retweeted out something where a lefty basically said, well, no, he literally said in his tweet, setting aside the legal argument, and then went on to justify why the court should side with Obama on this case. And I mean, literally, that's the most idiotic thing you could have. And I'm not sure I want to say that the court shouldn't be influenced by public opinion, but let the court be influenced by public opinion that's saying follow the Constitution, follow the letter of the law how it's written. Let the court be influenced mostly by what the law is, like you're saying. I think personally that the law is ridiculous. And no matter if you're getting subsidies for it or have a state exchange or not, it's an absolutely horrible experience to have to go through. My wife, just yesterday, we're transitioning from having insurance through my last job to now having to go and get Medicaid for my kids in the meantime, in the interim. And my wife was on the phone for 2.5 hours on hold with nobody to speak to because they didn't even believe that my eldest daughter existed. And so we weren't even able to sign up. And my wife had to get off the phone after 2.5 hours of being on hold to go pick up my non-existent daughter from school. So we didn't even get the assistance we needed. And that's what this super awesome funded Obamacare Affordable Care Act system that is supposed to help everyone and never cost anyone a dime.
Well, and there's an old joke in the legal profession, that if you can't argue the law, argue the facts, and if you can't argue the facts, bang the table. And that idea is really, what kind of showboat ambulance chaser lawyers end up doing, and what you see in TV law and so forth. We really have become kind of a society of table bangers. There is no more actually arguing law and fact. It is all about the feels, and it is all about the wants, and it's not law. And again, it's mind-numbing for someone who kind of is a lawyer and takes this stuff pretty seriously.
And let me ask one more question of Aaron. I know he's got to go, and we're going to let Aaron drop off. We're going to continue on for the last remaining time that we actually have on the show. But let's just say that the plaintiffs in King versus Burwell win, and those particular subsidies get struck down. There is going to be a not inconsiderable amount of public pressure on Congress, and I don't know how to evaluate it. I don't know how strong it's going to be, but it is going to exist to go in and write some sort of fix to the law. If not to reinstate the subsidies exactly as they are, because I think the GOP would block that, but to trade essentially some other reforms that the GOP wants for a fix of the subsidy issue. What do you view as the likelihood that the GOP plays along with that game, and do you think that they have, I guess, the stones, for lack of a better term, to just allow the chips to fall where they may, and allow, if it turns out to be the case, that the exchanges might collapse in the absence of these subsidy customers?
In the world I want to live in, this is the moment where Boehner and McConnell finally shine, and their huevos drop from where they've been hiding inside their stomach. And we see them actually roll out a unified effort to a reform package for healthcare that actually would work in our free market society. But instead, I think what we're going to see is they're going to go ahead and bend over and allow Harry Reid to dictate to them, even though they control both chambers, what these reforms should be. And basically, they'll fix Obamacare to where it's permanent forever and can never be repealed. That's what'll happen.
All right, thanks, Aaron. We're going to let you go. We're going to have everybody else is going to stick around, and we're going to move on to our next topic, which is going to be CPAC, which is, of course, the annual conference held in D.C. every year that all the big movers and shakers come to attend. And always the year before a presidential election year seems to be the biggest CPAC. 2011, 2007, and now here in 2015, because all of the presidential contenders and pretenders come and essentially present their case to the conservative audience there at CPAC. There's been controversy in years past about who comes, who doesn't come, who gives a good speech, who doesn't. And I'm going to just ask you guys very briefly to say, who do you think were your winners and losers at CPAC? And I'm going to go to Joe first. Joe, you still with us? Joe, you're on mute there. There you go.
Am I? Oh, interesting. Sorry. What's our question again?
Who are the biggest winners and losers among the presidential contenders at CPAC?
Let's see. At CPAC, I would think that I think Rick Santorum was definitely a loser. I don't think I know of anybody under the age of 65 who was inspired by anything Rick Santorum had to say, or just inspired by the fact that Rick Santorum is going to give it another go.
Boom, you know me. Ha!
Thanks, Bill. The biggest winner, I think, just in terms of keeping the momentum going, is probably Scott Walker, who is absolutely he's been on a roll for several weeks, and so I think that I think Scott Walker is probably maybe not the biggest winner, but might have been tied kudos to Jeb Bush for actually getting up on stage at CPAC and going. And the others, kind of had the performances we expected. I think Scott Walker, again, surprised folks just in terms of getting up there and once again showing that he is Scott Walker, and he has around his belt the heads of several Democrats that he's just tied on there, almost like voodoo head style, I think is what he does with unions, which is probably good.
So speaking of beheadings, what do you think about the controversy where he allegedly compared the union protesters basically to ISIS? I mean, to me, that's not anybody who raises that criticism doesn't understand how an analogy works as opposed to a comparison. But what do you think about that controversy? Is that something you think is going to end up hurting him in the long run?
That's still a thing we're talking about. I mean, I don't see anybody who's actually talking about that right now. And let's face facts here. The unions did take a whole bunch of people and protest outside of his parents' house and have made tons of terrible threats about him and his family. So I don't see where he's that far off in saying, that he's taken on the unions, he can take on ISIS. Now, I think that there's probably an intellectual difference there, and we have to recognize that that was more of a red meat line than anything else. But I don't think that's. I mean, again, I don't see anybody still talking about that. Whereas the Hillary Clinton emails, even the media is going to say that they're not covering it for 3 more weeks. Whereas they've dropped all the Scott Walker. Every Scott Walker attack has fallen off the charts in less than a day for the most part.
All right, Bill, what do you think? Who are the winners and losers just among the presidential candidates at CPAC, not including yourself in what I'm sure was an awesome labor panel that you hosted at CPAC?
How did you know what my answer was going to be? The biggest winners at CPAC were those who attended my panel. The biggest losers were those who missed out. And that was all I was going to say. And now I have nothing to say. Well,
so this is the same as every other question that I ask you. That's nice.
Yeah. It's self-involved and awesome. And to tell you the truth, I thought Walker sounded great aside from the ISIS thing. And an analogy, if Jeb Bush walked on the stage and said, oh, I could take on ISIS because when my children were 3 months old, they cried all night, and I stayed up, and I knew how to, handle business and quell disturbed people. That's not a good analogy. Just because you frame something as an analogy doesn't.
I didn't say it was a good analogy.
It was a ridiculous analogy, and
sure, but it is. But it's not. In that analogy, Jeb Bush is not saying his kids are ISIS. He's drawing upon what he considers to be a similar.
Now, if Scott Walker is the ascendant, which I hope he is, the ascendant guy who's going to run for president, going to beat Jeb Bush and all these other guys, if he's going to survive it, he has to be comfortable in his own skin. And if you show that kind of weakness where you're so desperate to show that you have foreign policy credentials that don't exist, the confident thing to do is to just say, all of us are better than Barack Obama. Barack Obama and the Democratic Party certainly aren't handling this well. Hillary Clinton hasn't handled this well. Trust me when I say I will surround myself with very fine foreign policy thinkers. That's all you have to say. You say, leadership, I think I have the right approach because I've talked with people who are doing this. If you are so desperate to prove that you know something about ISIS,
I think that's a fair criticism, Bill, but I think there's a difference between saying it was lame, which I think it probably was, and saying it was offensive, which I think people, some folks like that I respect.
You're setting up a straw.
No, I'm not. Jim Garrity says, Jim Garrity, who I like and respect, says, look, this is terrible for him to say that. Those union protesters are nothing like the people rampaging through the streets of the Middle East, beheading people and burning people.
I mean, he's also right, but I never listen to anyone who claims something is offensive. So I guess that's where he and I differ. But no, it's a patently absurd thing. It's a patently absurd case to make. People who I knew would never actually make an attempt on my life. You know, and this is another thing I can't tolerate about our modern discourse is someone says, I'm going to effing kill you, Bill, on Twitter. I don't take that seriously. People say stuff like that all the time on Twitter. When we blow everything out of proportion and we say, when we say the letter of the law in Obamacare doesn't matter, like we're doing in How Big, but we say, oh, the letter of this guy's tweet says he's going to kill me, therefore it's a serious threat. There's a disconnect here. Do you see how terrible that analogy was? I just pulled a Scott Walker. I'm out.
Well, Bill, I'm sure that Jimmy Hoffa appreciates your faith in the good nature and nonviolence of union leaders. Scott,
Jimmy Hoffa is buried under a football stadium right now. What are you talking about?
Because he was killed by Teamsters. Scott, what do you think were the big winners and losers of CPAC?
In what year? It's insane.
So the big winner, as is every year, Donald Trump, always the biggest winner of CPAC. The biggest loser was the guy who was walking around telling women that he was looking for his first lady, trying to pick up ladies, saying that he was on the lookout for his first lady. Other than that, more seriously, I think probably Jeb did the most good for himself at the event, just simply because he kind of held his own. He took the booze and the walkouts and all of that in stride. Sounded pretty good. And honestly, nobody else of the stuff that I saw actually was impressive.
Surprised to not hear you say Rick Perry there. I know he's your favorite, and I heard that he actually wowed the crowd pretty well at CPAC there.
Yeah. You know, I actually watched the speech and the Q&A, and it was fine. You know, but it was nothing. You know, maybe I'm just a cynical, jaded old man at this point, but none of the speeches I thought were actually quite good. A lot of them seemed kind of mailed in. And really, out of everybody, the one that I thought was surprisingly okay was Jeb. And, you know, it wasn't great, but at least he handled the criticism quite well. Everybody else, you know, I thought Walker's was fine. The ISIS thing is dumb, but not offensive. And, you know, honestly, I think the more important thing about the ISIS comment is that, you know, he is a newbie, and so he's not going to get the type of leash that some of the guys that have been around and been doing this for a while will get, and that matters for money. And so I think he did himself a disservice there when it comes to getting money from the donor class. They are looking for reasons to not like him. And he gave him one, and so that's stupid. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's early. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I think that in Walker's case,
who was walking around saying the first lady thing? Was that Neal?
No, there was a great article. So there's this you know, random 20-something young Republican who was walking around cruising for chicks, saying that he was looking for his first lady. It just truly, really, I gotta hand it to the guy. He really.
Okay, fine. It was me. It was me.
Okay, you know, because I was going through who the candidates could be to do that, and I know the Go Proud guys weren't allowed at CPAC this year.
Oh my goodness!
What's Neal doing?
All right, Brian.
I'm out.
Brian. Biggest winners and losers.
Winners and losers. I won't disagree with people that said that Jeb Bush was a winner coming in. I think, you know, he faced a tough crowd, people that weren't inclined to like him over immigration, over Common Core, and I think by all accounts he acquitted himself really well. And even the people that didn't agree with him sort of respected that he went there and spoke to the crowd and defended himself. I think the other thing, and I don't know, maybe it's foolish or maybe it's something that folks have overlooked, but I remember just, you know, a year ago, people were talking about how we'd entered a new sort of paradigm in the conservative movement where budget cutting and fiscal discipline was the most important thing, and that national security was no longer the priority that it was before. I think it's kind of interesting that that there doesn't seem to be any energy anymore behind the sort of continue to cut defense movement. And it's probably a statement more about how scared everyone is of ISIS, how concerned everyone is about a weak foreign policy and feckless view towards national security. But the fact that this crowd didn't have any, there didn't seem to be a split on national security. You had strong support for candidates that were saying, we need to do more, we need to be more aggressive, we need a more aggressive foreign policy on national security. Just, it seems to me there's been sort of a significant change that the old Republican Party is back in that respect, where it wasn't certain that it would be just a year ago.
All right, well, let's move on to our final news item of the day. I think we've beaten the DHS thing to death over the last 5 consecutive weeks. There's no need, I don't think, to revisit the issue now that it's been finally settled in the way that I think we all assumed that it ultimately would. But I do want to talk a little bit about the FCC's decision to, I guess, impose net neutrality by regulatory fiat over the last week. Well, I do want to touch about that briefly, and I'm going to go with my first question to Bill. One of the most interesting things to me about the reaction to the, I guess, fiat imposition of net neutrality is that Netflix, who stands to be, or who many people assume to be one of the most immediate beneficiaries of a net neutrality regime, has immediately come out and said, hey, wait, whoa. We didn't want any kind of regulation this extensive. And I think my question for you is, how long is it going to be before the end user consumer starts to see what I think are the inevitable consequences of this net neutrality regime, which is going to be, I think, inevitably higher prices and worse service?
That's absolutely what we should expect out of this. Josh Peterson over at the Franklin Center has written about this extensively, looking at all of the money that companies like Google and Netflix put into getting net neutrality passed. And they completely demonized the most hated entities in America, which are companies like Comcast. And it seemed to them to just be the perfect cronyist type policy, where their services get to be that they get to cut their costs in providing their services while using someone else's service, knowing that the government is going to protect their right to do so. But then when the government inevitably says, hey, we're going to regulate the entire thing like it's a commodity, a public good, then they come out and say, oh man, we didn't see this coming at all. You didn't? This is basically it's the way Aesop would have written out cronyism, where the unjust, villainous individuals like Netflix who invite this Trojan horse in knowing that it's full of Greek soldiers, then get to turn around and complain that they're burning the place down. It's absolutely insane, and I'm very happy to see Netflix unhappy about this.
So Scott, let me turn this over to you, Scott. And Bill's mentioned, look, Google, Netflix, and a lot of these companies have really demonized Comcast. And my perspective on this, regardless of kind of the policy implications on this, is that Google and Netflix didn't need any help demonizing Comcast. I mean, Comcast has demonized themselves to a huge extent over the last couple of decades, not just because they're a terrible company with bad company service, but also from a free market perspective. They've been among the most aggressive rent-seeking companies in the history of this country, next to AT&T. I mean, they operated as a regulated monopoly for years and have spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, not only in lobbying but also in public advertising, trying to prevent the imposition of any meaningful competition by force of law, either on the TV or on the cable side. And I guess is that, to me, it's you play with the tiger. Eventually, you're going to end up with the business end, with the claws and the fangs and whatnot. I mean, is that a fair perspective, or do you think that Comcast has been unfairly cast in this entire fight?
No, I mean, I think it's, you're definitely right that from a karmic perspective, Comcast is certainly getting what, in a way, what it deserves. I would be fine with that if it weren't the rest of us helpless consumers that were ultimately going to get screwed here. The fact is that Comcast is going to be just fine because it's Comcast. Same with AT&T, same with the rest. These guys are in power when the regulations are being put in place. And as we all know, we all understand public choice theory, and we all understand regulatory capture and all the rest of those fun things, that big businesses that are in power when the regulations are put in place miraculously maintain or improve their power. So I'm not that worried about Comcast at the end of the day. I'm a lot more worried about those of us that have to deal with this system going forward. The story that I just read yesterday that really curled my toes. I mean, the Netflix and Google buyer's remorse was kind of funny. But the one that I saw was that these new regulations are going to make it much harder to deploy 5G technology, wireless 5G technology, which totally depends, apparently, and I'm no geek, well, at least not that kind of geek, totally depends on differentiating content and differentiating service and applying all these different fun newfangled things and kind of this type of discrimination that apparently net neutrality is designed to prevent. So in order to deploy this super awesome technology that is 5G, we're going to have to run it through the regulatory ringer, which at the end of the day is going to mean worse quality, higher prices, and much, much slower adaptation. And that sucks. One of the super cool things about the internet and about wireless tech, for the most part, is that it's lightly regulated. And it's why among all of our services, telecom services are one of the areas where we're actually getting better stuff for less or the same amount of money. And now we're all getting Amtrak for the internet.
So one of the things, you talked about the things that everybody understands, which I don't know how many people actually understand those things.
Sorry.
One of the things that none of the idiots who have pushed this policy understand is that if you're regulated as essentially a public utility, the way that you set your prices is that you go to the government and you say, here is what it costs us to provide this service. We're allowed under the regulation to charge X amount on. Please approve our new rates. So to the extent that Comcast or whoever it is has to pay more to provide the services under the net neutrality regime, they don't take a bath. Right. They just turn around and charge that exactly back to you. I mean, this is the perfect example of cutting off one's nose to spite one's face at the end of the day.
Right. Well, and I also really like that that the EU just yesterday announced its own version of net neutrality, and it's actually more liberalized and less socialist and less restrictive than our system. So you know that when you are more regulated than the EU, you know you're doing something extremely, extremely wrong.
All right, guys. Well, we're about out of time tonight, and so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Want to thank our regular panel of guests, Scott Lincicome for the Cato Institute. Thank you for your time, as always. F. Bill McMorris of the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you for joining us. The first week since Bill has been on the program that I haven't fired him at the end of the program. Appreciate your contributions, Bill, and your lack of profanity. First time ever on the history of this show. I want to thank...
fuck yeah. Thanks, man.
And Bill's fired. All right, so I want to thank Brian Fonan of the Libre Initiative for joining us tonight. Appreciate you taking your time out of your week. And thanks Joe Cunningham for producing for us in the absence of Aaron Gardner, who we all appreciate his contributions as a guest. I've been your host, Leon Wolf. Thank you for joining us on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Friends, and we'll see you next week.
You forgot to thank Scott's eyebrows for being here today. Look good.
Yes.